Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Kat Ellinger, and this is ADHD Wild Women, a podcast for reclaiming the wild inherent in ADHD as a source of power, not shame. And I'll explain what I mean by this in this, the very first episode, as I set out something of a manifesto for the project. This is a bit of a change in direction from my usual work because normally you'll find me podcasting about film. But after my diagnosis of ADHD several years ago at the ripe age of 43, or at least I think it was, I can never quite remember because ADHD and it's all one big time vacuum. But since then, the subject's become something of a burning passion for me, especially the way in which women with ADHD are constantly misunderstood, underdiagnosed, misdiagnosed, and also tend to mask more than our male counterparts because of the pressure of social expectations or obligations, responsibilities relating to our sex, burdens which are placed on us as carers, as mothers, or even as employees. Modern women are supposed to be able to do it all, but what happens when we can't? With this in mind, this podcast is like a call to arms, to fight back, to resist social conditioning, to resist internalized misogyny that has had us turn things in on ourselves. It's a call of the wild to celebrate and grow through accepting and acknowledging, and most importantly, understanding our ADHD and how it conflicts with the patriarchal social structure. It's a call to say we're tired of this shit. It's time to do it our way, as ourselves. When I was first diagnosed, it came as a bit of a shock, like it does for many of us. And I've seen so many women speaking about this, how even after their kids were diagnosed, they never suspected they had it, largely because many had been seeking help for years with certain aspects of everyday life that they were struggling with. But they kept getting fobbed off by medical professionals, being told they were just a bit depressed, for example, must be a bit anxious, or even being misdiagnosed with more serious disorders like bipolar or personality disorders. And although some of these coexist with ADHD and some might hide the ADHD, a lot of times it's not even this, it's just ADHD. And that was pretty much how it played out for me until one day a friend suggested that I might look into seeing if I had ADHD. And that person also had a diagnosis. But even after my son was diagnosed, I was asked at that meeting by the psychiatrist if anyone else in my family had it. And in typical ADHD fashion, and this was the late 90s, I was genuinely perplexed because I didn't consider for a moment that it might be me. Despite the fact I'd struggled for years, I'd been in and out of local authority care as a teen. I'd burnt through social workers and psychiatrists like Kindle covered in petrol because my behaviour was deemed what they called beyond parental control, and therefore I was considered a danger to myself. And despite the fact that I was expelled from school for impulsive behaviour and uncontrolled anger at the age of 14, despite the fact I found myself homeless at 16, pregnant at 17, and had struggled so much with juggling the demands of parenting and studying and trying to hold down a job, not once did I ever think I could have it. And I guess part of that was that there's so many misconceptions about ADHD. There were in those days, but there's still so many now. And this really was before the internet took off. And back then, especially when I was at school in the late 80s, so little was known about ADHD in the UK. And what was known was largely linked to boys having it. And I think it's become commonplace now within the ADHD community to talk about this, how boys still tend to find diagnosis quicker because pre-puberty they tend to present as the hyperactive subtype more, while girls are more commonly the inattentive type. And I'll be discussing these elements in future episodes, but of course it's not entirely exclusive. There are girls and women who are predominantly hyperactive and boys who are predominantly inattentive. And personally, I have a combined type, which is actually really common across both sexes. So I'm talking in generalities, but it's been historically at least something that stood in the way of girls getting recognised as having ADHD, the fact that they tend to present more as scattered dreamers, than loud and hyperactive in childhood. And again, that was certainly the case for me, even though in my teens, I was constantly coming into contact with mental health professionals, psychiatrists, social workers, because they all wanted to know what was wrong with me. And not one of them suggested it may be neurological, though. In fact, some of them even thought I'd been abused and was acting out, which just seems totally fucking ridiculous to me now when I think about it. I went into the process of diagnosis after taking one of those online test things, which is how a lot of us start. And it came out with some really high number to indicate, yes, all the ADHD. And yet I'm still kind of half thinking, well, this totally fits with my experience. I'm also semi-convinced I'm going to come away from the process without a diagnosis because I still wasn't entirely sure. And I think that's something that's common with ADHD is, again, especially women, and women in general, even if you don't have ADHD. I do know men with ADHD also have to face this to a certain extent. But women have a tendency to second guess our instincts. We're questioned a lot more. So we have a tendency to second guess ourselves constantly because a lot of us have been undermined or not listened to our whole lives. And we go to the doctor for help and we're told it's anxiety or depression. So we take the pills and we follow the advice and nothing changes. And even though there's a little voice in the pit of our stomachs that's telling us something isn't quite right, this isn't us, this isn't what it is, we carry on listening to the advice we're given by professionals, even when it's wrong. And then we often conclude if the treatment isn't working, that it must be us, we must be broken. It can't be that the doctor got it wrong. And that's what I went through prior to diagnosis before I approached a specialist. I think that's so key in getting the right answers, going to the right people, because ADHD is highly misunderstood by the more general sections of the medical care sector. You need to see a neurologist or a specialised psychiatrist, basically. You need to see someone who completely understands the many different ways in which ADHD can present itself. And oftentimes, some of these symptoms are not all that typical. They're not things that are directly linked to ADHD. Well, I mean, they are directly linked to ADHD, but what I mean is they're not the overwhelming, overlisted symptoms. They're things that are far more subtle. Things that are not widely discussed, and therefore they're missed by people like GPs, for example. And for me, I was diagnosed with mild depression and anxiety for years and years, and I do suffer with those things on and off, largely as a result of the ADHD. So repeated failure, banging my head against a wall, struggling to get things done. But that wasn't really it. What I was facing was ADHD overwhelm, not outright depression, with a lot of frustration underpinning that, because unlike truly depressed people, and I've had periods of actual depression, but when I'm in overwhelm, I still want to do all the things. I'm generally positive and always making these big life plans, the next job, the next area of study, the next this, the next that, and hobbies coming out of my ears. But I couldn't break inertia a lot of the time. I couldn't get going. And of course, to someone who doesn't really understand ADHD, that can look like mild depression. Someone's not motivated, they can't get things done, they're struggling with things like self-care. But of course, it's not that. And so the treatment didn't help. It wasn't fit for purpose. And in the end, I just stopped going to the doctor and tried to keep on top of things myself until I hit burnout, which is so common for women entering middle age. And we're seeing so many of us, we've raised our kids, we've had successful businesses or careers, we've achieved all this stuff and appear to everyone else to be relatively high functioning. But then something just breaks. We can't keep it up. It's too much hard work to keep cheerleading ourselves on and masking our ADHD. And so many of us are now getting diagnosed in our 30s, 40s, 50s, even 60s and 70s. We're hitting crisis, we're hitting burnout, and we need answers. When I went through my assessment, I got to the end expecting the psychiatrist to say no. And he says the opposite. Yes, you have ADHD and it's actually quite severe. Let's talk treatment. And I went into shock. Like I said, I was 50-50. So there was 50% of me that said, yes, it's this. And that half was thinking, you'll be told you have it. And suddenly you'll have all the answers to every single thing that's ever gone wrong in your life. It will be life-changing and you will be instantly transformed and enlightened. A weight will come off you. While the other half is saying, don't be so stupid. Of course it's not this. Wouldn't you have known before? How can you be so oblivious? Why didn't any doctors pick it up? You're barking up the wrong tree. You're wasting everyone's time. So when it's confirmed, the half of me that's suddenly expecting angels with golden trumpets to come out and announce that I'm saved, that part goes into some kind of crisis mode instead. Because in that moment, all I could think was, it's never going to change. It's never going to get any better than this. You are disabled. You're always going to struggle. There's not going to be that one planner, that reminder thing that suddenly changes all of this. This is it. And then depression hit me for a few months and I was really wallowing in it and feeling sorry for myself. The book that changed my life, the one that got me out of my funk, my self-pity, and enabled me to see that certain aspects of ADHD could in fact be a superpower. The book that changed my perspective was Faster Than Normal by Peter Shankman. Now, on first reading, it was a revolution, and I still recommend it, but going back to it, as I often do, knowing more, especially about my own ADHD and how it functions, I'll say that there are certain aspects of that book that aren't that highly relatable to me. A lot of it is, but this is written by a highly successful entrepreneur who's managed to capitalize on their ADHD and build a seriously lucrative career. Someone who had a pretty early start, early support, and most importantly, someone who's a man. So perhaps he didn't come across the additional barriers that women have to face. And now because he has money, he talks about how his personal assistant helps him so he can avoid things like decision paralysis, or how he goes off on a plane to Asia to focus on finishing his book. Like the guy literally gets on a plane to Asia to focus on writing this book, gets on a long haul flight, writes all the way to Thailand or wherever, and then gets on another plane back to the States and does the same thing coming back. So while it's amusing, it doesn't really relate to, say, my reality of having ADHD as a quote-unquote everyday person, let alone my reality as a single mother, juggling 25 part-time jobs and a bunch of kids. So while I'll always be grateful to that book for making me realise, hey, not all of this is bad. You might not be broken, or at least not as broken as you feel, just different. And it was the first time I'd read about ADHD written about in this, like it wasn't a disability, that it wasn't something that was wrong or a disorder. It was all about personal acceptance. I'll be forever grateful for that and do totally recommend that book. But my own journey into accepting and working with ADHD has been quite different to Shankman's. I think key, for me at least, in learning to work with the strengths of my ADHD is also accepting the challenges. And so while I'm generally positive about it these days, and I do wholeheartedly support the neurodiversity movement, I feel like this is just a different operating system, not broken, not wrong, just different. But I'm also super aware these days that I don't give in to ableist thinking and recognise that parts of our ADHD in our current environment are a disability. We live in a world that's largely designed for neurotypicals, and I fully admit that I struggle in that world. In employing an ableist mindset, we can push ourselves too hard, and I no longer have any interest in doing that, especially not to myself, let alone in advising other people to do it. So part of the reason I wanted to do this podcast was to reach out to others like me. And I know there's many of us and many more on the cusp of either getting that diagnosis or finally realising why we've struggled all these years. And we need each other. And so now, as part of that road to understanding and acceptance, I really want to connect to others to share resources and experiences, because while medical research might still be in its infancy when it comes to how sex and gender relates to ADHD, biological aspects, even like the impact of hormones, pregnancy, menstruation, especially menopause, can have on ADHD. I think we can find strength together, sharing and supporting each other. And my guiding force for this podcast, although over the course of various episodes, I want to look at all the different elements of ADHD and how they impact our lives, our sense of self. And my guiding force for this is a very important book, important to me. Clarissa Pinkola Estes' Women Who Run with the Wolves, which was first published in 1992. In her book, Estes takes various folk tales and fairy tales, and she uses them to examine constructions of femininity, womanhood, in order to expose the systemic pressure on us. And she also uses Jungian analysis as well. But most relevant to this podcast, I want to draw attention to the passage in her opening chapter about the suppression of the wild woman archetype in Western society. And it reads like so. My own post-World War II generation grew up in a time when women were infantilized and treated as property. They were kept as fallow gardens, but thankfully there was always wild seed which arrived on the wind. Though what they wrote was unauthorized, women blazed away anyway. Though what they painted went unrecognized, it fed the soul anyway. Women had to beg for the instruments and the spaces needed for their arts, and if none were forthcoming, they made space in trees, caves, woods and closets. Dancing was barely tolerated, if at all, so they danced in the forest where no one could see them, or in the basement, or on the way out to empty the trash. Self-decoration caused suspicion. Joyful body or dress increased the danger of being harmed or sexually assaulted. The very clothes on one's shoulders could not be called one's own. It was a time when parents who abused their children were simply called strict, when the spiritual lacerations of profoundly exploited women were referred to as nervous breakdowns, when girls and women who were tightly girdled, tightly reined and tightly muzzled were called nice, and those other females who managed to slip the collar for a moment or two of life were branded bad. When I read this for the first time, my mind was absolutely blown. I didn't understand that I had ADHD then, but I felt it on some sort of unconscious level. Because as a woman with ADHD, and I feel like even though all women have the wild woman in us, and that's what Estes is talking about, she's talking to all women to reclaim that wild seed. For us with ADHD, those who aren't neurotypical, that wild woman is always much more on the surface. And it's harder for us to hide. It's harder for us to compromise, harder for us to mask. Because to live an inauthentic life, to try and hide parts of ourselves, it drains off too much of our energy. And we're already fighting too many other little battles throughout the day to move forward, to get shit done, to waste even more energy. ADHD by its very nature can be incongruous to traditional modes of femininity. We are constantly deemed as too much by others and judged for it, just as much as we end up judging ourselves. Too emotional, sometimes even aggressive, a total no-no for women. Too loud, talks too much, too sexual, too independent. We don't do well in situations that require us to shut up and put up, and nor should we. And when it comes to this ludicrous idea, for example, that women should be well kept, and I could never subscribe to that, not just for feminist reasons. I've just never had the energy to focus on stuff like painting my nails. In fact, one of my main stims is biting them. I've had that since I was a child. And most days I'm lucky if I can leave the house with matching socks, if I bother to put them on at all. And of course, I'm not claiming to speak for all of us. Many of us do get great personal pleasure from doing things for ourselves like painting our nails. But it all has an energy cost, and we're already working with a deficit, so we end up having to pick our battles. And many of us do struggle with physical self-care, even getting into the shower, brushing our teeth. But somehow that's neglect, as it's phrased, is seen as unladylike, unnatural. It's unnatural to suck at this stuff. And it ties into this again ridiculous notion of what being a woman means. This caring, organised archetype, well turned out, preened, hairless and plucked, made up, passive, serving, all of these things that are in direct conflict with aspects of ADHD. And bringing my kids up, all of whom are neurodiverse, 5 of them, they're either on the autism spectrum or have a diagnosis of ADHD or both, because it runs riot on my dad's side of the family. There's not a single typical person in there. But bringing my kids up and not knowing I had ADHD, let alone what it meant, I spent most of those years suffering so much, beating myself up so much, because I found it impossible to do the things that most other women around me just seem to do naturally. Keeping the house clean, for example, getting the kids to school on time. So I internalized that as, I must be shit at this. I must be a terrible person, a terrible mother, a terrible woman. And of course, now my kids are grown up, that's not what they remember. They remember the laughter. They remember the fact that I was always on their side and always had an interest in them and their own fixations. They don't remember the times that we had to spend all day in a laundrette because Mum had let the washing pile up yet again so much that it wouldn't fit in the machine at home without needing 15 loads. So she needed to go and use 3 commercial-sized washing machines to get through it. They don't remember the times they came home and the house was a mess. Because honestly, if there's one thing I've realised now in middle age, none of that actually matters. In the opening chapter to her book, Women Who Run with the Wolves, the author tells this story of Loba, which admittedly I only know from this book, but it's one of the wild woman archetypes that Estes uses as a call for arms for women to return to their wild selves, as an emancipation from systemic oppression, misogyny and patriarchy. And I just want to read that story now because I feel it sums up my journey so far with ADHD and setting my own wild self free. And this is from page 23 and 24 of Estes' book. Loba. There is an old woman who lives in a hidden place that everybody knows in their souls but few have ever seen. As in the fairy tales of Eastern Europe, she seems to wait for the lost or wandering people and seekers to come to her place. She is circumspect, often hairy, always fat, and especially wishes to evade most company. She is both a crower and a cackler, generally having more animal sounds than human ones. I might say she lives among the rotten granite slopes of the Tarahumara Indian Territory, or that she is buried outside Phoenix near a well. Perhaps she will be seen travelling south to Monte Alban in a burnt-out car with a back window shot out. Or maybe she will be spotted standing by the highway near El Paso or riding shotgun with truckers to Morelia, Mexico, or walk into a market above Oaxaca with strangely formed boughs of firewood on her back. She calls herself by many names: La Hucera, Bone Woman, La Trapera, the Gatherer, and La Loba, Wolf Woman. The sole work of La Loba is collecting of bones. She collects and preserves especially that which is in danger of being lost to the world. Her cave is filled with bones of all manner of desert creatures, the deer, the rattlesnake, the crow, but her specialty is wolves. She creeps and crawls and shifts through the montañas, mountains and arroyos, dry riverbeds, looking for wolf bones. And when she has assembled an entire skeleton, when the last bone is in place and the beautiful white sculpture of the creature is laid out before her, she sits by the fire and she thinks about what song she will sing. And when she is sure, she stands over the criatura, raises her arms over it and sings out. That is when the rib bones and the leg bones of the wolf begins to flash out and the creature becomes furred. La Loba sings some more and more of the creature comes into being. Its tail curls upward, shaggy and strong. And La Loba sings more, and the wolf creature begins to breathe. And still La Loba sings so deeply that the floor of the desert shakes, and she sings, and the wolf opens its eyes, leaps up, and runs away down the canyon. Somewhere in its running, whether by the speed of its running or by splashing its way into a river or by way of a ray of sunlight or moonlight hitting it right in the side, the wolf is suddenly transformed into a laughing woman who runs free towards the horizon. So remember, if you wander the desert and it is near sundown and you are perhaps a little bit lost and certainly tired, that you are lucky, for La Loba may take a liking to you and show you something of the soul. And like Estes, I believe the key to setting ourselves free is to become our own La Loba, singing over the bones of our old lives, bringing certain parts of ourselves to life as a form of liberation and letting other parts die, where messages about who we are as women with ADHD have been clouded with negativity that comes from a wider society. We let those bones die, and the ones that resurrect are truly free and wild. And so this first episode is a call to others who feel this way as we move through this journey, looking at that skeleton before singing over the bones to create a new image for ourselves, one that's truly rooted in feminine power through the creation of our own archetypes and definitions. And that brings me to the end of this episode. If you've enjoyed this, and do please share, like, tell your friends, spread the word. We're starting a pack. And if you want to get in touch and share your own journey with me, you can reach me at ADHD Wild Women at gmail.com.